No, and it was crazy. So our lead pastor occasionally follows the lectionary,
Yeah.
and it came up that it was going to be like 4 or 6 weeks on Revelation. And so he was like, "Hey, we're going to do a series on Revelation." And I was like, no, we're not. No, we're not. I'm not. I've never touched Revelation. Like I grew up with the Left Behind series, which when you think about it was introduced to me at a very young age that shouldn't have been. Like I started reading those probably fourth, fifth grade, about the world coming to an end. Jesus takes all his people back, and everybody else is like in fear and left behind. And there's an antichrist who sounds an awful lot like Donald Trump. And then there's all these, like his character could, it's really that character.
It's true.
Um, and I remember being terrified, absolutely terrified that I was going to be left behind and be terrified that I was going to get whisked away.
Mm.
Like it both was really, really scary sounding.
So you were afraid of getting whisked away about being raptured?
About being raptured. Like all of it sounds terrible. Like I didn't
Whoa.
want to just disappear. Yeah, I don't know why. That's weird, isn't it? I didn't want to go.
That's interesting because I was like, yeah, I hope I'm raptured.
You don't want to be left behind.
I
I
didn't
was
even
afraid that
that you would be raptured. I didn't even consider the possibility of that fear. You just said,
I don't know why. But again, I'm like, how old are you in fourth grade? 10? I'm like 10 years old reading these
yeah.
novels
Well, I
about the
mean,
end times.
that's true of that's true of everything that we talked about this last time. Remember, like, what do you teach your kids now? Because there's flood stories where all of humanity is destroyed, genocide stories, and left like the end times is every some will go, some won't. Who knows? It's
Right. And you don't know where you stand until that day.
yeah,
You're not
and
sure.
oh man, this brings back my band Plano East. We were when we were in high school, we covered this song called Wish We'd All Been Ready that DC Talk
From Larry
covered.
Norman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
DC
Yes.
Talk covered Larry Norman. It was a song that was huge in the 70s, about, life was filled with guns and war. All of us were trampled on the floor. I wish we'd all been ready. Insinuating, you know, some were whisked away, some had to stay and face this tribulation. Crazy.
Yeah,
So,
I grew up like with
yeah.
that and with that fear. Like I remember I had that tape with that cut with the DC Talk cover of that song,
Yes.
right? And it's like two men standing on the hill, like one was taken and one's left. So
Standing
I was
still.
afraid, like standing still.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, I know all of it.
So
Yeah.
when my pastor was like, "Hey, we're doing this series on Revelation," I just brought up all this like I've never really even read it other than like when I had to in school. I never studied it. I was just like, this is bizarre stuff. I don't want to deal with it.
Yeah.
And everybody talks about different things or like the mark of the beast. Like, so I was just like, I don't want to touch it. But then when I started reading it and started reading a bunch of commentaries about it, I'm like, this book is fascinating.
Mm.
And we were lied to about what a lot of it actually means.
Oh, no, oh yes, lied to. I also wonder how much people just didn't have much in terms of knowledge around the context of it, and or how long that information's been around. My guess is for a long time, but the evangelical tradition has always lagged behind there. So okay, so your pastor comes to you, says he wants to teach on this because it's in the lectionary, and you're like, hell no.
Yeah.
But I imagine it happened. It was so like, what did you do to prepare for that?
So I came across this book called Discipleship on the Edge by Daryl Johnson. And right away, so I'm all about the Old Testament. One of the first things he says in the book is there's over 500 references to the Old Testament in Revelation. And I was like, okay, now maybe
Now
maybe
I'm
there's
in.
some value in it. Okay, so I'll take a look at it.
Yeah.
And then I started reading it, and I think what happens is I in the church, I can't remember if we talked about this before, but we grew up thinking that the Bible is self-exegeting, that we're supposed to be able to just open it and know exactly what it means. And that's
Yes.
what I think people have done with Revelation, right? They've opened it up and then like this is a literal book. And when we talk about prophecy, we think that means fortune telling of the future.
Hmm.
And so when you read it on the surface level, it is scary and it does seem like, you could see how it gets misinterpreted. But
Yes.
when you read it in its context, knowing that, like, so if you believe John's writing it from prison, he's trying to get something out to the people of God. through the prison censors, he speaks in like a code that they're going to remember. They're going to recognize these symbols from the Old Testament in a way that the prison guards aren't going to get it. So like if you can recognize that and see that nothing is what it seems, it's all this deeper level symbolism, then not only is the book going to be less scary, but it's going to be more rich and you're going to
Right.
see so much more in it.
Right.
And that's what I found.
Oof. Well, you read this one book. What are some of the what is can you lay the groundwork for what some of the context was that people may not know about that book, of that is, like, you're right, is quoted all the time, that people talk about the mark of the beast, they talk about antichrist. I heard someone in school today say that there's this information in there about how old the earth is, which it absolutely is not in there, but like there's so much lore about it. So can you
Right.
provide a little bit of context around what the setting was for this book?
Yeah, so it's written, well, I believe it's written by the disciple John, and he's like 60 years old at this time. So this is like 92-ish AD. So years after Jesus has come and gone, and then he is on this rocky prison island and has this vision, revelation, and like one of the words I think is most taken out of context is apocalypse, which has come to mean this like Marvel Avengers, like giant battle, end of the world. But apocalypse really means unveiling. That's
Right.
simply all it means. Like when you go to a theater and the curtain opens, like that's an apocalypse. So
Right.
all it is in its context is God showing John like what God's up to right now. And it's
Mm,
just full of all these symbols that again would have been the Jewish people would have recognized and it would have had more meaning to them.
yes.
Um, so when
So
it's talking about like a dragon, it's not a literal dragon. And
right.
there's always more going on.
Right. So for anybody wondering, like, he's exiled because is this during Nero? Is that the idea, or a Roman emperor that's oppressing this new sect of Jews that have, like, sort of followed after this Jesus cult, they would have called it at the time.
Yes.
And so they're persecuting these people. John is someone that's not afraid, and so he gets exiled on Patmos. Correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. So his job essentially is to continue to give people hope.
Right. And he's trying to keep them geared up. He's trying to get them to recognize the power that the empire has on them and how they're adopting the culture of the dominant empire. And he's cautioning them to this of
Mm,
how the empire is sneaking into their lives. And that's what it's about. He wants them to fight back and rebel and push back.
mm. Oh, it's so good. I mean,
Which is why when I started reading it, I'm like, this is for us now.
right.
If we can get past the scary feelings about it or the ways it maybe has been misinterpreted.
Yeah. It's really for any anybody now, because I feel like there's this anti-establishment sentiment that crosses both liberal and conservative boundaries, that, like, all of a sudden everyone does not trust authorities. And so there is this warning that actually is present throughout the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. It's always there because it's always this underdog community that's like, these empires are oppressing us and someday we'll be
Mm-hmm.
set free. This is like the ultimate. The empire is oppressing us. Here are the ways that it's happening, and we're still going to be set free. You know, this message of hope is still alive and it's still going to happen for us.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm so curious. Have you done the sermons yet?
Yeah, we did. So we had them in the spring, and then I was at a couple of teen camps this summer as a speaker. And I was like, you know what? I think this could be a teen camp series. So I did it at a teen camp too, which,
How'd they
I don't
take
know.
to?
They actually they really engaged with it. One of the good things is they, I guess, have not grown up the same way that maybe I had with so
Oh,
many preconceived notions about Revelation. So that was wonderful to discover.
fascinating.
Yeah.
What's that like?
Yeah.
what's it?
They
What's it?
like,
No,
right?
go
Like
ahead.
to not be afraid of Revelation. Like that's kind of how I introduced it. Like I shared this story. I remember once, like freshman year of college, and this is like the dark ages before internet. I remember once like laying down to take a nap and waking up, and like my roommate was gone. And so
Hmm.
like I went to the bathroom and I didn't see anybody. I got back to my room, like I called my friend and she wasn't there. And I called home and nobody answered. And in the back of my mind, I literally was like, was I left behind while I was napping? Like, but they just don't have this fear.
Whoa.
They were like, oh, that's weird. And I'm like, no,
You don't
people don't do that. People don't worry that they've been left
how do you live? What is this freedom you speak of? I
behind. Right.
the thing that, if anyone didn't grow up this way, and especially for folks like that, our parents' generation, so you're around my age, um, was the one that was swept into what they called the Jesus movement in like the 60s and 70s. It became very popular because of the book of Revelation. There was this, like, Calvary Chapel became really big for their prophecies around when this all was going to go down. And hippies were like storming into churches. They were so taken by this new message, and it became like my parents, and I don't know about yours, but so the 80s was flooded with like raising kids with this knowledge of the apocalypse and the rapture. And so we
Yes.
got soaked with it. Apparently, this new generation didn't get that same gift.
Thankfully, no. Thankfully, they are not afraid in the same ways. So that was good news. That
But
was good
they
news
but
for
they
me.
still engaged with it.
They really did. And like one of the things that was most groundbreaking to me was the mark of the beasts,
Mm.
um, which, I've heard everything growing up. Like if you get a tattoo, that's the mark of the beast. Like when I got my first tattoo, I heard that. And my first tattoo is a Christian symbol. It's called the ichthus. It's like the Jesus fish with the Greek letters on the inside.
Same,
And like it's
Carrie.
right. And I'm like, people are like, that's the mark of the beast. I'm like, it literally in Greek means like Jesus Christ, God, Son, Savior. I don't know how that's the mark of the devil.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that like that's the mark of the beast, or like even in the past 2 years, I've heard like the vaccine is the mark of the beast. So like this kind of
Yes,
language is still alive and well. So when
yes.
I got to that section, I'm like, I want to dig in. I want to know like what's the mark of the beast? What is this?
Mm.
But so in the book of Revelation, when it talks about it, it says the mark of the beast is the number 666. And that's another one of those things like has spun its own lore.
Oh
And
yeah.
even like non-Christians have heard that number and associate it with Satan.
Yep.
So um, the number 666, which it says in Revelation that it's someone's name, it says it's his name. And then, so in the Hebrew tradition, they use letters a lot to equal numbers,
Yeah.
and they'll put, or the numbers equal letters. So there's other outside the scriptures, Hebrew poetry, where it'll be like, I'm in love with so and so, and her number is 789. And that's the equivalent of like her number in Hebrew. So
Mm.
that's what John is doing here when he talks about the beast. So he's like, his number is 666.
Mm.
And those numbers translate to the Hebrew letters. That means Caesar Nero. That's the
Mm.
translation of the number 666. So the number, we've given it this power that it was never meant to have.
Yes.
So that was like the first thing that was groundbreaking to me.
I think that's enormous because people look for those numbers everywhere.
Right.
And people are still into numerology. I mean, people love that stuff. Anyone's looking for a sign that's going to confirm for them what they already believe or are afraid of. Right? And so if you see 666 in like like on what do you call it, Kino or something, like if you, wherever you see
Right.
it, like you're gonna, oh my god, what's about to happen.
Like, right. That's a bad sign. It's the devil. The devil's at work over here. Like it's
Yeah,
some kind of, I don't know, but that's not what it meant. It wasn't meant to be the symbol. And it wasn't even connected to Satan. It's connected to the Caesar at the time.
yeah.
It's the mark of the Caesar, the empire, the ruler of the empire.
That to me was really profound to figure out. Have you found at all that people are resistant to that information?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I think so many things. I think what's one of the hardest things about the Christian institution of church is we haven't been taught to ask questions. And I think whatever information got to you first, like lays this foundational bedrock. And you can hear things and think maybe that's a nice idea, but it can't change that foundation. That foundation won't move. So, like
Mm,
in my own local church or in certain places, yeah, that information does not change what they really believe.
right. And what do you do in those moments when someone pushes back on you, like, well, you've been deceived, or like what does that pushback look like, and how do you respond to it?
I just have to I say what I believe is true. and I just continue to ask the question, and
Mm,
then I just have to let it. I try to let it go, um,
yeah.
and try to maintain my faith that I'm where I'm supposed to be and supposed to continue asking the questions and not let it silence me in what I think is my role in the church right now,
Yeah. Do you
which is to help people ask questions. I
Beautiful.
think.
Yeah, it definitely. That is my experience of what you do. When you Do you ever get called the names like apostate, or like you're preaching heresy or anything like that?
Not to my face, but I'm sure it happens behind my back. That's another thing about the church. They're very, my experience is people are very polite to your face.
Well, it's New England, Carrie.
But,
You can't be you can't be telling people what you really think to their faces.
right.
Well, I mean, I think generally we have this we have this culture of we'll talk to someone else about the problem we have with a person,
Yes.
and
That
we'll find,
triangulation is rampant. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, wow, so you're in the belly of the beast. That's another one of those phrases, right? Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So you're in it, and it's the beast, and like, it's there's a lot of language in the whole of the Bible about Babylon and Rome, and the what people I found, and I'm finding a lot more lately, are very resistant to context having a factor in how we interpret really anything, but mostly the New Testament scriptures. People are really resistant because they're like, it's not in there. How do you know that? It doesn't say that, right? So they're genuinely feeling like, no, no, that's not, you're reading too much into it. We don't know that's true. Do you get that same kind of feedback? Or people like, well, how do you even know that? That's like cemetery taught you that. That's what people call seminary. Yeah. Like,
Right.
do you get that kind of pushback as well?
I think so. Like in the like with the mark of the beast, when I preach that on a Sunday morning, the other important piece of the mark of the beast is in Revelation. It says it's marked on their forehead and on their hand.
Yeah.
And if you're well versed in scripture, the people of God are already supposed to be marked on their head and their forehead. So if you go back to the Shema in Deuteronomy, which is love the Lord, hero Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.
Yeah.
That's what's supposed to be guiding their thoughts and their actions, marked on their head and on their hands. And so, again, context to the people receiving John's letter, they would have hit that right away and been like, wait, I'm already marked. I'm already led by God in my thoughts and God in my actions. So I'm not going to be led by Caesar Nero in my thoughts and actions. It's about that empire, the influence of the empire. Who's controlling who? Like, who's in charge here? Is it going to be the beast or is it going to be God? That's what that passage is about. But I think people would rather hear it as the mark of the beast is going to be someday this chip that's in your arm that's going to be used to track your whereabouts, or it's your phone, or it's the vaccine, because those are also like easier things to swallow than to have to really challenge, like, how am I being influenced by the culture? How am I influenced by the use of my phone? How, like, people don't want to ask those questions about themselves, and that's what
Mm,
the scriptures are really asking us to do, is examine ourselves and see ourselves in the story, and not just take, well, I didn't get the vaccine, so I don't have the mark of the beast.
right. Wow. Okay, you gave this non-church going guy some chills with that little that little sermonette. That was beautiful. I think that it's really interesting because within Christianity, well, okay, I'm keeping reminded there's Christianities in within evangelicalism, that tradition that I come from. Belief is what matters. What you think is what determines what part of the community you fall into. So it's not your actions are like fine, but they're filthy rags, you know? That's the way they're referred to. And so they have the head thing in some way, but the hand thing is missing in many ways. So and I think because actions have been so removed from what it means to be an evangelical, it makes it nearly impossible to break through that brainwashed wall. And I'll call it
Mm-hmm.
brainwashing. You don't have to do that. It makes it nearly impossible because the experience of life doesn't penetrate. I'll say from my experience, when I grew up being a Christian and I was going to public school, they would teach about evolution in like ninth and 10th grade. And I was easily able to shut that out. Like, well, they're of the world. I don't have to believe that anyway. But it wasn't until I got to good old Eastern Nazarene College and we had a professor, a Christian professor teaching evolution, that's when I started to get messed up. And so it's like the world's not going to convince us to change because we don't give ourselves in a way like we're keeping ourselves from being influenced by the world, right? I think that's the way that we were taught to fortify our minds. But I think that that action piece, that connection piece with all people, whether they're Christian or not, is really the thing that prevents us from being able to take in new information that isn't, you know, what we were already taught.
No, we grew up with like Bible trivia. Like if you could answer all the questions right or whatever, like that's the mark that you were really dedicated. It's that about the knowledge.
Yeah.
Whereas all of scripture is about those actions and love and accessing your emotions. So we just read Emotionally Healthy Discipleship by Pete Scazzaro.
Yeah.
And one of the first things he talks about is how like we've been taught to remove our emotions too as Christians. Like you're supposed to like not be guided by your emotions, but like God, I believe God gave us those emotions as a way of like informing us and how to live. And he basically says like the mark, we shouldn't be judging like how deep somebody's relationship with God is by their answers about Bible trivia. It's about their actions and how do they live. And
Mm.
that's what the church is missing completely. Like we don't know how to hold each other accountable or how to challenge each other to live better. Like but the Bible's all about that. The Bible's about the fruit of the spirit. Like we should see those fruits in your life if you're really living it out.
Mm.
But we mostly just care that you have the right answers.
Right. I don't care what you're doing. Just tell me that you believe the right thing. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so you gave these sermons about the Bible's most famous and like elusive book that everyone seems to have answers for. Like the 700 Club is, which people probably don't even know what that is anymore, is like based on the book of Revelation. Did you get people coming up to you that were like, "Whoa, this changes everything for me"? Like, did you see light bulbs go on?
For some people, yes. It was, I think, transformative. And the first time they grew up in similar contexts, and the first time somebody talked about it and wasn't pushing an agenda or scaring people into, get saved or you're not going to get raptured. Um, it was just totally flipping it on its head. Like it is a political book, but not in the way that you think.
When people, at least of our generation, hear this kind of information, it's such good news to us because we want to stay part of this community, but less and less do we feel like it meets our needs and connects with our experience of the world. And so when you're able to say, well, it's always been about resistance to these things, it just connects in a way that is so beautiful to see when it transforms you or someone else that you're talking to about it.
Right.
Yeah. And so you've had this experience now of within a church context and at a youth, what was it? It was a camp?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, of talking about this very political book that was very dangerous to get released, that has been completely misunderstood throughout the centuries, that Martin Luther didn't want to have included in the canon, that has always been argued about. Do you feel like within yourself that you want to study it more? Like, what's next about this, or is it just kind of the thing that's like, this was in the lectionary and it was interesting and cool, and we gotta like move through the next thing?
I feel like I'm going to keep going back to it because what I find most fascinating when it talks about Babylon and like it says all empires, like this is about all empires are evil and you have to question what are their motives. Like even when you get past them, when you look at the beast and the dragon, like they're trying to mimic God, they're trying to pull people away. Like if you really read it, it's about people being allowed to be manipulated by the powers of the empire of the culture around them.
Hmm.
Um, and I just want to keep going back to that and keep finding those 500 references to the Old Testament because it just makes the story like so much more rich to me when I see its context and where it's grounded and the message that it would have been for the original hearers. The
Yeah.
closer we can get to that, I think the more truth we'll discover about us as people and for me at least who I think God is.
Hmm. Yes. Have you seen a connection between our culture today of the people that have a hard time embracing messages of hope for those who are oppressed compared to those that accept it quickly? Is there a commonality that you see? Is there something that you think gets in the way of us being able to experience the Bible, the message that Jesus brought of, uh, salvation for those who are poor and oppressed, and like that whole mess? Have you noticed some consistency around who's having a hard time accepting it and who embraces it quickly?
I think it's very easy for the church to say in words that they accept that message, but very difficult to live it out. Um, because I mean, our human instincts, whether you're in the church or not, are really for obtaining power and things, right? And those are instincts that we're trying to discipline ourselves against, to be led by that love for others, that care for others. So I think that's where it's hard for the church to move past. Like, once we get a little bit of power, then we want comfort, then we want to protect it. And then it's harder for us to open up again after that point.
Mm. It is the biggest issue we have with privilege, isn't it? That this is a message for people who need hope. People with privilege and comfort don't necessarily need hope. They've got it.
Right.
We're
Right.
okay. So this is why I think messages like the one you're talking about are very quickly embraced by those who experience earthly oppression. And why people so quickly gravitate towards, we'll move back to Matthew and Luke for a second. Jesus has the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, and then he has like the Sermon on the Plain in Luke. In Matthew, he starts off with blessed are the poor in spirit, like sort of like a humility. But in Luke, it talks about blessed are the poor. It is not the same word. It's a very different meaning in some ways. And you can tell who gravitates more towards the poor in spirit and those who gravitate towards blessed are the poor. Um, it is something that I can't get past, that the people who have the hardest time dealing with conversations about oppression and ongoing discrimination, anything like that, are those who experience privilege and even want to deny that as well.
Right. This Sunday actually is Freedom Sunday, where we talk about raising human trafficking awareness. And so I'm preaching this coming Sunday, and I'm doing Isaiah 58, 1-10, which is God basically railing on people and being like, you say you're fasting, but you're oppressing your workers at the same time. And so I have to consider, for my church's context, and this is again I just finished a year there, so I'm still learning the context. How do I make that palatable enough for them that they'll hear it, but then challenging enough that it might push them to take one step further, like one step to think differently about how their unintentional decisions have impacted others?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think every context has to look differently, because genuinely you want to be effective, right? There is a difference between just saying what we believe to be the real message and feeling better about ourselves because we did our part, and moving people from where they are, because that's the goal. You want people to respond when they see suffering. And I know it's a weird thing to say, but because we're not experiencing all of this in our own homes or in our lives, you got to make people feel it in a way that really connects with their sense of purpose and meaning and their values. And then like that once you do that and people experience what it feels like to walk alongside people that suffer. I mean, Nicole Braddock Bromley talked about this, how much that changed the way that she experiences the world once she walked along with people who suffer in a different way than she had. Because we all suffer, right? But experiencing someone else's suffering will change you. So, I mean, I don't envy your position anymore. I don't know that I ever envied that position or like really relished in it, but it's like the work of trying to make something palatable and help people understand something and connect and move with it. There's no easy
And
task.
still start that slow. Like, I mean, the Bible for me is this revolution in slow increments of moving a people forward.
Mm.
And that's when I have to want, like, I don't know that I have the patience for the slow work.
Mm.
So I'm always trying to discern how far can I push while still, caring for people and coming alongside them and not alienating them. Like, how do I get them to go one step further?
Yeah, that's so good. Because truthfully, you're right. I mean, my experience of the Bible, Hebrew and Christian, is one liberation story after another. It's always there. And then you get to Jesus, the Jesus story, and he's like spends this time in the wilderness, and then he's just like dealing with all, like, it's just constant pushback to liberation because people have a vested interest in holding on to their comfort and power. So what you as a pastor do is tell a liberation story and try to invite people into it. Um, and when people don't feel like they need liberation here and are only looking for it in the hereafter,
Mhm.
it's a hard sell. And I think that what you're doing within the context of the Christian church that many would call Babylon in America is very liberation worthy work in my opinion.
I
Is there
hope
any?
so.
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah. We do, right? That's why we do it. Yeah. Did you end up coming across there's another book called Reading Revelation Responsibly? Have you heard about that one? Did
I
you read that?
haven't read it.
Okay.
No.
I heard that's another good one. But I think there's going to be enough, like, people know this book, they have enough interest in it. And I have to say, reading it just without any of the information that you read in another book is still very difficult. Like, you can't,
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
like, getting your mind
It's wild.
right. So, like, getting your mind back 1700 years into a Jewish frame of mind when you're oppressed, like, how do you can't do it. So we do need those
No.
aids.
Yeah, that's where like when I was talking with my husband about it originally, he was like, "Why do you think when we were kids they totally misinterpreted it?" I'm like, I think it's because they literally picked up the text alone and read it and like it as if it's self-exegeting and we can figure it out. And it was never meant to be that way. Like even the Jewish scriptures were meant to be read in community with other scriptures, other texts that were written and other commentaries. That's how it was designed to be in community. It wasn't designed to just be read and you figure it out on your own what the dragon means to you.
Right.
So right, it's okay for us to need other tools alongside the scripture. We do need them.
Yeah, it's not Lord of the Rings where, like, you can say what does this thing mean to you? It has a particular meaning and context for a particular group of people, and to study that like is a lot of work. It's a lot of work that a lot of us don't have time to do. So it's nice that there are people who spend their lives studying these things and then can put it out in like these smaller books. you know So, oh man, we could talk about Revelation forever, but I'm curious what's coming up next as you're doing this Sunday, talking about liberation and like in a very real way. Are there any other big topics or ideas that you're dealing with, that you're grappling with, that you have to bring?
Oh my gosh, yes, Dave. So I'm also reading this book called Abraham's Silence by J. Richard Milton. And it totally flips the story of the binding of Isaac. So when
Mm.
Abraham goes to sacrifice his son Isaac. So I've always struggled with this story. I've always struggled with the idea that God tests us. That just doesn't seem like the God that I've come to believe in or God that loves me. So in the story, Abraham thinks he hears from God that he's supposed to sacrifice his kid. And so Abraham's like, yeah, sure, let's go do this. And his son carries the load of wood up the hill.
Mm.
And his kid is like, hey, dad, where's the sacrifice? And Abraham's like, God will provide it, but it's going to be you.
Yeah.
And he binds his kid up and he puts his kid on the altar and he's getting ready to kill him. And at the last minute, God's like, no, don't do it.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to be this moment of testing for Abraham, testing if his faith is strong enough that he's willing to sacrifice his kid for God.
Mm.
And that story is so disturbing on so many levels for me
Yeah.
that I just have never been okay with the spiritual answer of like, but it's okay. He passed the test.
Right.
So I've started, right? What a traumatic thing, like to watch your dad drag you up a hill and he's about to kill you, but God wanted it this way.
Who recovers from that one?
Right? How do you move on from that?
Yeah.
So that's never sat well with me. So I've started, like, there has to be another way. And what Middleton suggests and what I've really come to see, he believes Abraham failed the test, that he didn't pass the test, right?
Okay.
Right? That changes everything, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. So earlier on in the book of Genesis, God is about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham is like, no, God, don't do it. Don't do it. He pushes back in what Middleton calls a ragged prayer. Like, he pushes back on God. And the suggestion is that God's looking for this vigorous dialogue partner. And so Abraham a few minutes ago is like, God, you're not the kind of God who destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. Don't do it. But then when it comes to his own kid, he doesn't push back. Okay. And that makes so much more sense to me.
Keri, I'm getting chills again. This is actually a consistent theme in Torah, because Moses also does this with God.
He pushes back. He's like, God, don't do it. You're not the kind of God who does this.
And God relents.
Yes.
Oh man, I'm getting chills from this one. That's brilliant. Because the Sodom and Gomorrah story is one of like, all right, I'll give you, like, I will, like, just a few, if there's just a few people, okay. And it's just like human beings having some kind of say over what God's going to do and not do. But it is, I love that, what did you call a sparring partner? Is that what you said?
A vigorous dialogue partner. That's what Middleton calls them.
Vigorous
dialogue. A vigorous dialogue. That's what God's looking for. And if you read through the scriptures, if you read through the book of the Psalms, a third of them are these lament Psalms where people are crying out like, God, where are you? Why are you doing this? Like, how long are you going to do this to me? Like, a third of the Psalms are pushing back on God, being like, God, this isn't supposed to be how it is. Wow. And for that to be in the canon, like, God's okay with those questions. God opens it up for dialogue.
That changes everything, Keri, because it's like, not only does it change that whole story that I actually was like, whatever, it's ancient and blah, blah, blah. But I love that now. It also changes this idea that you can, like, change God's mind. It just changes so much stuff. I feel like it's a really, I'd be really intrigued to hear how that one goes.
Yeah, I don't know how that goes into church, because that's going to be another one where if I ever preach that on Sunday, people will be like, isn't that nice? They call me the young pastor all the time, which I think is like a nice way of saying you're inexperienced or you don't know what you're talking about. I have a feeling I get like, that's nice. But
wait, aren't you older?
I don't know. For me, that just, yes. So I'm 40 and I'm still considered young. So I don't know at what point you hit the, like, I live enough life experience to have something to say. But
it's a really great way to diminish somebody's knowledge. People will do that, and then simultaneously they'll be like, "Oh, out of the mouth of babes,"
Right, little children, what we learn from children. But if you're 40, it's still not enough.
It's never enough when your worldview is challenged.
Right.
And the thing is, these stories that you're learning, these deeper and maybe truer meanings, who knows? If they come alive for you, it's like, isn't that something worthy of embracing? It's more alive to talk about, well, God was waiting for Abraham to fight back on this one. That gives.
And so God had to intervene at the end. God had to be like, well, you're an idiot, so I have to provide a sheep now and stop you because you didn't stop yourself.
That's so interesting. Oh, I love that so much. Oh my God. Yeah.
So that's what I want to get into next. And then its connection to Job, rethinking the whole concept of Job too, which I think is this idea again of God testing, and at the end God silences Job. But when you look at it deeper, we probably don't have time to go into all of this, but there's a lot to rethink in Job as well.
Give me a nugget. You got to leave us with a nugget.
Oh gosh. So at the end of Job, like what the way that I've originally heard it, so God comes out of this whirlwind and is like, were you there at the beginning of creation? Were you there at the foundations of the earth? And then Job is like, I've spoken too much. I put my hand over my mouth. Like, and I've heard it. That's God's putting Job in his place to be like, you don't know what you're dealing with. But if you really look at what God says in the whirlwind, so God talks about, Job initially is like, this is terrible. It'd be better if I wasn't ever born. So he's kind of challenging, like, God doesn't know what God's doing with creation. And so God comes back and is like, but I did all these things and I set it all in motion and it's kind of chaotic, but this is how I made it and I love it. And then Job is like, I don't want to say anything. And then God talks again. And God tells this story of the Leviathan and the behemoth.
Yeah.
And he talks about how they were created to be these chaotic creatures and chaotic stuff comes out of their mouth, but God created them that way and loves them. And then God compares Job to the Leviathan. And so what he's saying is like, I created you to have a mouth that speaks. And sometimes it's chaos, but that's okay. Like it's God inviting Job to speak. And then God says at the end that like Job is righteous because Job is the one, like Job's friends were trying to rationalize what happened to him. They were like, well, God has a purpose for your suffering. There's a meaning behind it. He says all the things that we say when something happens to someone. We're like, it has meaning. Everything happens for a reason, Job. Or they say like, you must have sinned and you brought this upon yourself. And in the end, God is like, God says they're the ones that were wrong. Those weren't the right things. The right thing was when Job is like, God, where are you in this? And that reshapes Job for me. It's not God testing Job. It's not God silencing Job. It's again, God inviting Job as this dialogue partner where it's okay to say, this sucks right now, God, and I don't know where you are. And it's not okay to say everything happens for a reason.